Okay, I think we'll start. People are still joining, but we are on quite a tight schedule, so I'm going to get going now. Welcome, everybody. A very, very big welcome to the first in our four-part series of webinars exploring place efficiency. A reminder that if you want to attend any of the future webinars, please sign up for each one that you want to attend. Just signing up to this one doesn't get you into all of them. So I'm Wendy Russell. I'm a research fellow at the University of Gloucestershire, and I'll be chairing the proceedings today. It's good to see so many people with us. Numbers are still ticking up and up and up. We've got 275 odd people registered from 17 different countries and time zones. So thank you to those that have joined us in the middle of the night. And there's a brilliant spread of practitioners and policy people too. So across a range of professional areas like playwork, early years, healthcare, design, urban design, and much more, which is great. Apologies if you don't feel seen in that list. You are all very, very welcome. So this webinar is in webinar format. So your cameras and mics will be off for the whole time. So if you're watching in bed, that's fine. If you're eating your lunch, that's fine. If you want to do the dusting, do that too. And the channel of communication is with hosts and panelists through the chat. So Marianne from Play Wales, give us a wave, Marianne. Will be monitoring the chat and responding to questions if she can. And she will also curate questions for speakers at the Q&A session at the end. The webinar is being recorded and you will be sent a link to the recording after the event. We are so excited to bring you these 4 webinars on place efficiency. They've been funded by the University of Gloucestershire and ably supported by the team at Play Wales and Genero, for which we're very grateful. So give us a wave, Danielle from Play Wales and Ben from Genero. We have 2 Bens and 2 Mikes on the panelists today in this call, so plenty of opportunities for confusion. The webinar series is brought to you by myself and Mike Barclay and Ben Tawil from Ludicology. Give us a wave. Our involvement in place efficiency began right at the start in Wales, through Mike previously being a place efficiency lead at Wrexham Council and Ben being involved in the assessments with Mike. All of us, excuse me a minute, all of us involved in researching place efficiency since the start, so that's getting on for 15 years now. We recently also carried out a review of contemporary research into children's play, policy and practice commissioned by Play Wales and publishers Playing and Being Well. And so some of the ideas that we're going to be talking about today come through all that research. So this introductory session aims to set the scene for the whole series, and it introduces the concept of place efficiency through doing 2 things. First, we'll look at the background and history of the concept with those who were there at the start. And I'll introduce Mike, Theresa and Keith in a minute, but give us a wave. Mike, Theresa and Keith. Thank you. And then after that, Ben and Mike from Ludicology will introduce key principles and conceptual tools that we've been developing through our research in place efficiency. There is inevitably a heavy Welsh bias to this, but we're confident that the ideas, the principles, the conceptual tools, they're all applicable more broadly, and they've been tested at least in England, if not further afield. So after these 2 sections, there will be an opportunity for questions. So please post your questions in the chat as we go along. Don't feel you have to wait until the end. We're on a mission here. This series of webinars is a call to action. We want nothing less than to embed the concept of place efficiency as an organising principle into policy and practice everywhere across the world, as recommended in General Comment 17 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we're setting off with a bit of history and context. Why Wales? Why place sufficiency? And how did the idea of place sufficiency get into General Comment 17? So I'm really pleased that we can have answers to those questions and more from the people who were there at the time. So I will briefly introduce our panel. So Mike Greenaway has been Director of Play Wales since its inception in 1998. He's been instrumental in advising the Welsh Government on children's play policy, on its adoption of the world's first national play policy in 2002, and then a play strategy in 2006. And then in 2010, the development of a statutory duty requiring local authorities to provide for play. That is the play sufficiency duty. He's been a trustee of the International Play Association, the IPA, since 2008, and with colleagues was instrumental in the development of General Comment 17 that supports Article 31. And he's a play worker for 2 weeks every summer. Welcome, Mike. Theresa Casey is an independent consultant and writer and a trustee of Playgrounds for Palestine UK. Theresa served as president of the IPA from 2008 to 2017, the period in which IPA worked towards the publication of General Comment 17. With Valerie Franchek, Theresa co-chaired the IPA group leading the international call for a general comment on Article 31, and she and Valerie subsequently co-led the core group managing the general comment drafting process on behalf of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, facilitating involvement of experts, advocates, and children's groups from around the world. And the last member of our panel is Keith Towler, who is the current chair of Play Wales and is a patron of the venture in Wrexham. He served as Children's Commissioner for Wales between 2008 and 2015, and during this period published a number of reports, including those on advocacy, child protection, play, child trafficking, young carers, disabled children and young people, and looked after children. And Keith was also a member of the IPA working group that was asked by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child to take a lead role in helping to draft general comment on Article 31. So I'm really pleased to have our panel members. If we can see the panel's members as panel members, that would be great. So let's start with Mike and the why Wales question. Mike, you were campaigning for a place sufficiency duty in Wales ages ago and eventually got it into the Children and Families Measure Wales in 2010. I just want to make it clear to our participants that this was before the publication of General Comment 17, which was published in 2013. So you started it. So the first question is, why the term place sufficiency?
Hello, thanks for having me. Can I think it's probably useful, just bearing in mind that we've got an international audience, to say, because I might, when people look at this, they will say, well, there are different names. The Welsh Government used to be called the National Assembly. I'll just call it the Welsh Government. If I talk about local authorities, for those people in the rest of the world, I'm talking about municipalities. And this was a measure. It is what everybody else would call an act, and in future it would be called an act. I think it's worth saying that we started our thinking in respect of the legislation started from the outset in '98. There was a state of play report was commissioned by the Welsh Government. And it had a couple of recommendations. The primary recommendation is that the Welsh Government should adopt play policy. Play Wales was commissioned to draft that, and after some discussion, it was adopted. It was published in 2002, and the play policy was a statement of principle and belief. It was a vision for the future, and it committed the Welsh Government. They committed themselves to producing a play strategy. The policy effectively said, this is where we are and this is where we want to be. In the development of the play strategy, it was an interesting experience because it's not just about playgrounds and play work. There was a recognition that pretty much most of the departments of Welsh Government had an input or an impact. Their work had an impact on children's play. So a working group was established by the government that had representatives from key stakeholders and representatives from the different departments in the government. And we worked together. Play Wales undertook the secretariat, and we met with representatives of those departments and looked at how they could change what they do to improve things. The recommendations were produced between 2004 and 2005. And it's worth saying at that point, the first recommendations, there was a recognition there that the Welsh Government it needed to legislate to pass place a statutory duty on local authorities. Why? Because there was a recognition that play has always been a Cinderella service. Whenever there are cuts, the first to go are those where there is no duty, and we'd experienced play having over the years having lost its funding when there have been cutbacks. Right, sorry, I'm just checking notes so I don't miss anything. I mean,
I think that's great. I'm
okay.
intrigued to know where the term play sufficiency came from.
I am getting there.
You're good, yeah.
Just to say, because credit where credit's due, we called for a legal duty, and in the response, there was no reference to it at all. But 2 years later, I had a conversation with an official who told me that the minister had just given him, I think, 5 days in which to begin to draft the wording for a legal duty for children's play. Sorry, I'll just go back. The other part of our thinking was that whether or not there's a legal duty around play, the reality is pretty much every law that a country passes has an impact on children's play. It's often an unintended consequence, but there was a sense that play was disadvantaged as a sector, was disadvantaged by the fact that there was nothing explicit about it. So we wanted that as an explicit. So John, the official, spoke to me and we talked about what should be in it. I'd been involved with the youth service over many years. I'd been a principal youth officer, and the youth service had looked at demanding, I think is the best word, that there should be a statutory duty for the youth service. And as a result, I was quite familiar with the legislation. And this was one thing that is just very specific to the UK, and I think we've been particularly fortunate in it. And that is that the 1944 Education Act, section 53, talks about community facilities and places a duty on local authorities to provide them. It is just after the Second World War, and it explicitly mentions playgrounds and play centres. So in other words, it already explicitly mentioned fixed provision and play workers, because who else would run a play centre? And it talked about adequacy. So the duty was to provide adequate provision. And so my suggestion was, given that there was that piece of legislation, which was only rescinded in 1996, that would be the appropriate wording to use. So I think the best way of putting it is we worked together, and the proposal was submitted. It was then, do you want me to go into the detail of the process quickly? Wendy?
If it's very brief, yes.
Oh, it'll be very brief. But it's just one of the key things is that the government lawyers came back to us and said that they could not use a word like adequacy, or by then it had begun to move to sufficiency, and sufficiency, adequacy are the same meaning, because it was too ambiguous, and it wouldn't be possible to measure it. And my argument at the time was, look, it's been in government legislation already from the 40s. If it's good enough for them, then surely it'll be good enough for us. The other thing that really was important in that 44 legislation, whilst there was a duty to secure it, there was no assessment process. There was no oversight of whether local authorities were doing it or not. And that was something that needed to be included into the legislation. Do you want me to go on?
That's great. No, that's great. Thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about why, as you were getting towards saying that there should be this statutory duty and that it should be framed as a sufficiency duty, why was it then incorporated into the Children and Families Measure Wales? Why that particular piece of legislation?
It just happened to be there.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's a piece of legislation, and this is the way lawmaking works. It was a piece of legislation that was already being developed, and the minister that we had at the time was aware that there had been this request. And so at that point, it was introduced. Initially, it was very low down, that legislation, literally as a miscellaneous item. By the time the process of drafting the Act had been completed, the play sufficiency duty was Chapter 2. So it raised in priority. Excellent.
Well done. Okay, if we can bring in the other two panel members, let's move on to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, to the process of getting General Comment 17 and drafting it. So, Theresa, do you want to kick us off with briefly introducing, telling us what a General Comment is and talking about IPA's campaign?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to revisit that process. It's actually really lovely. I've had a few opportunities recently because time has gone by since the General Comment was published in 2013 to reflect on the process again, and it's a very interesting and intriguing story, I think, looking back. So first of all, a General Comment is issued by a committee of the UN, in our case, obviously, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And they're really about addressing an area of the convention where it's felt that it has been overlooked or misunderstood, or governments haven't really understood what it is that they were promising to do when they signed up to the convention in relation to that part of the convention. So in our case, play. We initially asked for a General Comment just about play, and ultimately the General Comment was about the whole of Article 31, and for lots of different reasons I'm really pleased about that because of the sort of holistic nature of Article 31. A General Comment, it's an official document of the United Nations. As I say, it's issued by the UN Children's Committee, and it's issued directly to all the governments of the world who have signed up to the convention. It doesn't add to any obligations that governments already have. I think that's a really important thing. So we're not adding in lots of extra asks or telling them there's lots of extra obligations that they now need to fulfill. What it's doing is explaining properly how they should be implementing the provisions of Article 31 in our case. So not adding to it in any way. And I guess in our case, you know, it wasn't long after the publication of the convention itself that Article 31 in children's right to play became known as the forgotten article of the convention. I found reference to it as the forgotten article just within a few years in the UNICEF handbook that's about implementing the whole of the convention. And of course, IPA is an international organisation devoted to children's right to play and, you know, looking for how we can support children's play rights all across the world, was very alive to the fact that Article 31 in the right to play was starting to disappear down some kind of imaginary hierarchy of rights, which, you know, of course, in reality doesn't exist. the committee themselves were becoming concerned about it. So they were recognising that there was poor recognition of Article 31 and the right to play, there was poor implementation, and there was evidence of that as well. So two sets of very clear evidence for the UN Children's Committee was that countries, when they were reporting about how they were implementing the convention, weren't mentioning play, weren't mentioning the Article 31 rights at all. Very rarely, apparently, if you had a big sort of national festival of sport or something like that, that would get a mention in a country report, but play was just really overlooked. And then the other side of the coin was that the UN committee itself was overlooking Article 31. So they weren't issuing recommendations known as the concluding observations back to any of the governments to say that they should be doing better around Article 31. So, you know, clearly there was a whole kind of atmosphere around this, suggesting that the right to play, Article 31, a little bit like Mike was saying as well on a national level, was just starting to disappear within that context. So what was IPA going to do as an international group? Well, I found a lovely quote from Professor Lothar Krapman, who was a member of the working group and the focal group, who works really closely on the General Comment. And I don't know if you're meant to have a favourite UN committee member, but I think Lothar was probably the favourite for lots of us. A really brilliant friend to all of the work that we wanted to do around play. And so he said, I just found a little quote where he had said that it was really important that the UN committee and the International Play Association found each other. And I think that's right. So it was about, we were very concerned about how children's right to play was just being overlooked, wasn't seen as a right. It still had that air of being either trivial or a luxury or something you only have to concern yourself with if all the other rights have already been, you know, captured and are looked after. And the committee had that sense as well. So it was really about that coming together that enabled the campaign that we set off in 2008 to work towards a general comment, came out of that. That kind of meeting that we found each other and we were able to work together. I'll just say a little bit about the process up to the point where the decision was made for a general comment. So the International Play Association is an association of members all over the world. We're not a big organisation. We're not an organisation with staff, offices, very much cash. None of those things, but definitely an association of people who really committed to a cause, really wanted to make a difference, could see that there were things that were happening around the world for children that, you know, if we could put a focus on children's play, could be made better. So what we did with the resources that we did have, the people resources, was first of all to put together an international group of co-signatories asking the UN committee to publish a general comment on play and Article 31. And then we kept on writing to them. So we wrote to them every few months and said, could we have a general comment? And we've got a new reason to ask for it. And we built up a sort of body of evidence, really, in relation to what we were asking. And I think the process when we were trying to influence and campaign for Article 31 in itself was really important, because by the time we'd done that, we were much better prepared for the decision. So I was just going to show a couple of things you might remember. So there's this lovely document, which actually has my daughter on the front. Children's Right to Play, an examination of the importance of play in the lives of children worldwide. We were able to commission Wendy, our host, and Stuart Lester to write this, looking at, as I say, the importance of children's play. So starting to gather the evidence. And this was supported by the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, who were another amazing friend to the cause. And then we carried out global consultations on infringements to children's right to play, did this around the world. And again, we kind of used the people power of IPA to do that, because we were able to just sort of connect in with groups of people around the world who were able to run consultations themselves. So by the time we got sort of end of 2010, had a lot of contact with the committee. As Lothar had said, we'd sort of engaged in quite an intensive period of connection and working together. And on, let me see, 10th of March 2011, we got a letter from Yang Yi Li, the chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, saying that they were impressed by the worldwide campaign to promote greater compliance with Article 31, and that they would like to have a general comment on Article 31. And just to close that little circle, so that was in March 2011. The IPA Triennial World Conference was held in Cardiff that year, if you remember. Lots of people have memories of that amazing conference. So there was two things that stand out about that for me. I think from the opening ceremony, one was that we were able to announce to, you know, the play world that there would be a general comment on Article 31 that we'd been working, you know, towards. And the other thing was that we presented our IPA International Right to Play Award to Wales. And I think we gave it to the First Minister, Carwyn Jones, at the time, in recognition of the work that had been happening in Wales. And I think when we get on to the next question, we could sort of see how some of those things then start to intertwine in relation to how play sufficiency ended up in the general comment.
That's great, thank you. That's a fantastic summary. And that conference also was celebrating IPA's 50th anniversary as well, wasn't it? So all those things came together at the same time. So Keith, I don't know what your memories are of once that process got underway of supporting the committee to draft a general comment. What are your memories of that, and what was it? Give us a flavour of those discussions, and particularly given we're tight on time, when play sufficiency crept into those conversations.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Wendy. Listening to Theresa and Mike has just sparked all the memories are kind of firing off one after the other. I became Children's Commissioner in Wales in 2008, you know, and when you become a Children's Commissioner or an Ombuds, you're kind of thrust into children's world and really trying to see the world through children's eyes, but in the context of all kinds of things you know nothing about. So things like health, children's care, you know, what it's like to be a child walking through the street. And I was trying to get my head around what it was that a commissioner should be doing in terms of advocating for children. At a time when all these adults were talking about what is adequate, what might be sufficient, what I was trying to do at that time was to try to say to children, all of those different contexts, what are the most important things in your lives, you know? And two things came through for me at that point that were really, really strong. The first was we have a voice, and children need a platform upon which they can have their voices heard. And the second, which I was surprised by, I remember Mike telling me I shouldn't have been surprised because, you know, I should have known this. But it didn't matter whether we were in a hospital, a care setting, a children's prison. It didn't matter where we were, in homeschool, whatever. Children inevitably started talking about play or trying to express themselves in playful ways, dealing with really difficult subjects. So as those kind of discussions were going on amongst the adults about play and sufficiency, and we'd come off the back in the UK of a UN committee reporting cycle, which had pointed out very clearly that children were being pushed away from things like playgrounds because they were being shut down, and that they were being pushed into public spaces where people were viewing their behavior as antisocial, that there was a real disconnect going on. One which was about how children perceived the world, and how they wanted to express themselves and get their views heard. And the second was kind of adults trying to come up with something that was around sufficient or adequate, or what do we mean about giving children the opportunity to play. So I remember quite a lot of those. I was amazed to be invited to be a part of the IPA working group, because I viewed the IPA, you know, Theresa says we're not a big organization, we haven't got any money, we haven't got any people. My first exposure to the IPA was that conference in Cardiff, and I thought, crikey, the IPA, this is a serious outfit. I need to be on my top game here. And then to be invited to be part of their working group, I, you know, was a bit kind of, oh, crikey, okay. But But what I wanted to bring to that kind of debate, I suppose, was to ground that in children's experience. And as we were debating things around sufficiency, it just struck me that one of the challenges for us across the world would be to say to children and to hear their answer, what is enough in terms of a play opportunity for you? What does that look like? And I can remember some of our early discussions really beginning to focus in on what do children think would be a sufficient or an enough play opportunity for them in whatever the setting, whatever the context, whether that, you know, and I can remember Theresa and other colleagues on the IPA talking about children in war zones and conflict situations. And I also remember me thinking about children living in poverty, children saying not enough playtime in schools, for example, all kinds of different contexts, and bringing that into those early discussions and trying to define something that would be meaningful for governments across the world. Wow, that was some challenge.
Thanks. I think that's a really good grounding, actually, in what place sufficiency means. Briefly, you did manage to get it into the general comment. Why do you think it was strategically important to do that in the general comment? What were your hopes for the idea of a place sufficient, of legislating? So the general comment says that they recommend that states parties legislate for children's play using the principle of place sufficiency. Why do you think it was strategically important to get it in there? Very, very briefly.
From my point of view, and you know, I was having discussions with the other UK children's commissioners at the time, you know, and the role of children's commissioners is about holding governments to account, to do the right thing by children, and to you know, uphold and promote children's rights in the context of the UK. For me, it was all about accountability, and it was about saying to the UK government at that time, that weren't hostile, but they were neither proactive in relation to children's play. What is it that we could do that could pin down those responsible for the delivery of opportunities for children? And my hope at the time, and I can remember saying to Theresa and colleagues, and them saying to me, no, that's not what the purpose of a general comment is all about. It's not, because what I wanted to do was pin down, this is what governments must do. This is what municipalities must do. And I was really, really trying to jealously guard my role as someone would hold those governments to account. So my hope was we would come up with something that would make my job a lot easier in holding those governments to account for the delivery of children's play. And in terms of the way in which ministers at the time in the UK government were beginning to think about children's play and sufficiency, having got over the fact that Welsh ministers had done this before they had, because people are always concerned in political level about being the first of something, was to drop the being the first in terms of just doing the right thing. So for me, it was about having something in the general comment that would really make governments think what their accountabilities to children and to sufficiency would be all about.
That's great. Thanks. Theresa, do you want to add to that at all in terms of the idea being strategically important and what your hopes were, very briefly?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of an extension of what Keith was saying there. I think one of the things that happened, I was relooking at some of the drafts, and through all the early drafts, there was mention of sufficient time or sufficient space in various different places throughout the general comment in relation to schools, or actually the sort of conflict situation, you know, right the way through, but it didn't really stand out in quite the way. The latter part of the general comment is about government's obligations, as Keith was saying, so to respect, protect, fulfill. And up until quite late on in the drafting, addressing the principle of sufficiency wasn't part of that section on obligations, but now you'll see it's in the very first paragraph in relation to obligations to fulfil children's right to play in Article 31. And rereading, I just read a draft without it, that paragraph, and a draft with it. And what it does is it adds this kind of depth and intention to the whole of that paragraph, which then lends itself all the way through the rest of the explanation about what obligations are. So that, like, this idea of sufficiency then is embedded as this principle all the way through what it says about municipal planning, about schools, about post-conflict situation, all of that. And I so I think that's an incredibly important kind of addition and elaboration that really, really helps to make the general comment what it is. So it's only a few words, and it was only a small insertion, but actually dramatically changed the whole flavour of that final section.
That's great.
Wendy, could I add to that?
Yes.
Theresa and I were talking about this earlier this week, actually. It would be fair to say that because of the work the International Play Association did in lobbying, when it came to writing the general comment, the initial drafting, it was within our gift we were told we had to find an author who would meet the requirements of the UNCRC committee, but we had the opportunity to brief her, and it was Jerison Lansdowne we worked with, and Theresa and I spent certainly my recollection is it was quite a long day with her, going through key principles that we felt should be in there. So as far as sufficiency was concerned, given that the Welsh government was the only government that ever legislated, there was a certain logic that we may be directing people there, but we also talked about focusing on time, space and permission, and also because we've recognised how valuable it has been, a requirement or an expectation that local authority departments should work with one another, because it is a cross-departmental issue. So you can find play hosted by pretty much any department in a local authority, and so they do need to be able to work together. And the other thing that was really important to us, and I should have mentioned it before, but it is there now, is that we don't use the word provide. Because if there's a legal duty on a local authority to provide something, it immediately becomes ineligible for trust funding, for example, the National Lottery. Whereas to secure, if the responsibility is to secure, then the local authority can say they can work with other organisations who can access funding to draw that in. And I think that's actually that pivotal, and interestingly was included in the 1944 legislation in the Education Act, but it served us well.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, all three of you. It's been brilliant for me to go back and kind of reflect on those heady days of getting a general comment on Article 31 and of the beginning of getting a legal duty based on the principle of place sufficiency. We will be looking at what changes have happened since the introduction in Wales and in Scotland as well, and plans in other UK countries in the next webinar, which is in February. More information on that later. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat. So let's move on now. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you. Let's move on now to introduce some key principles and tools that we've developed through our work on place sufficiency and through the recent literature review, Playing and Being Well. Let me briefly introduce Mike and Ben first, though. Mike Barclay and Ben Tawil work together as Ludicology, providing consultancy, research and training on children's play. Since the commencement of the place sufficiency duty, Ben and Mike have been researching and developing approaches to doing place sufficiency. So what does it actually mean? How can we use this? Mike always calls it a beautiful piece of legislation to do place sufficiency at neighbourhood, local authority and national levels. And they've been working both in England and Wales. So over to you two.
Oh, thanks, Wendy. We'll just share our screen and give it a little bit of time to catch up. It should be there now. Yeah, super interesting conversations there between yourself and Theresa, Mike and Keith, and hopefully our presentation will build on that. As we've already heard, the UNCRC General Comment 17 and Wales Play Sufficiency Duty sort of explicitly highlight that need for a new approach to children's right to play. Historically, we've been kind of caught up in a view of children that sees them in terms of what they'll become, producing and consuming adult citizens, I suppose. And that view often reduces play to either an immature frivolity or an instrument for development. And that dominant lens has shaped and prioritised certain policies, practices, spatial arrangements, cultural values and other such like. For example, prioritising the movement of vehicles, goods and workers, as seen children withdrawn from streets as a space for play. Prioritising the privatisation of space, bringing every small space into use for housing, commerce, industry or traffic flow, has seen a reduction in the space where children can play. Prioritising formal learning in school has seen a shortening of playtimes. Prioritising child development has seen a focus on educational out-of-school activities that has left less time for unstructured play. And that's to say nothing of the massive expansion of the toy and gaming industry and private pay-for-play places. That phenomena that I've just kind of explained there has been referred to as a perfect storm, where the unintended consequences of prioritising the economy over other aspects of well-being has reduced the time, space and permission for children's self-organised neighbourhood play. Children's outdoor play has been increasingly confined to designated play areas, mostly the playground. And whilst these are valuable community assets, children's play is often seen as out of place anywhere else. And this is a form of social and spatial injustice, where children to a large degree no longer have access to what the wider public realm has to offer. What's refreshing about both General Comment 17 and the Play Sufficiency Duty is the directive to do things differently, to try and develop a new lens, a new way of seeing children, childhood and their play. This was exemplified actually in the Deputy Minister's speech introducing the Welsh Play Sufficiency Duty, when they kind of emphatically stated that this duty meant readdressing the dire way in which children's play had been provided for and required a radical rethink about why play matters, where and when play takes place, who has responsibility for it. And in their words, this is more than just counting playgrounds. It's a real new way of thinking, and it was emerging, as Mike and Theresa and Keith have talked about, well before the duty was brought into being, but it's emerged since then as well, and it acknowledges children's right to participate fully in public life, largely through play. It highlights the importance of formal, informal spaces and their accessibility, diversity and quality, and the opportunities for play in schools, health centres, youth spaces and beyond need to be considered alongside the broader systems of governance that influence children's play. These might include, for example, policies and plans associated with health and well-being, planning, housing and education. This holistic effort, therefore, can't be confined to one department or funding stream. It involves a meshwork of relationship amongst children, adults and professionals, organisations and systems, as well as resources, objects and less tangible factors like sensations and desires. Over our years of working with Play Sufficiency and informed by the recent literature review that we did together, Wendy, this approach has evolved into what is described as a relational capability approach for playing and being well. This approach emphasises the dynamic and reciprocal relations between children and the various dimensions of their lives, physical, emotional, social, economic and political. Influenced by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capability approach, it foregrounds social and spatial justice and defines a good life as one where individuals have the capability to pursue what they value. And for children, the capability to play means having the time, space, and permission to play, and being able to make the most of the resources and opportunities. This presents a strong ethical and moral, economic, and social argument for adults to work towards producing those conditions through both policies and practices. The principle of play sufficiency, therefore, is about much more, as we've said, than designated play provision alone. Play is not simply confined to specific times and spaces. Playing is a fluid and polymorphous process that emerges wherever and whenever conditions allow. And whilst children have the capacity for playing and being well, converting that capacity to a capability is largely relationally dependent on the conditions available to them. As such, it's the job of those involved in play sufficiency to work with that meshwork of relationships, leveraging their capability to work towards producing the social, environment, and mental and personal conditions through both policies and practices for children to play, and in so doing, creating the capability for children to support their own well-being.
So here's a little example that illustrates what Ben's been talking about. I'd like you to picture the scene. So in a suburb of a small city, there's a large tree with 3 rope swings hanging from it, and it's located in a wider grassy area, which has become a focal point for children's play. This is a place where children regularly gather. They're aged approximately 8 to 12, and they can often be found swinging, climbing, and playing around the tree. The main swing, which dates back 6 or 7 years, was originally installed by the owner of a nearby house, but recent additions have been made by other local children, including a 12-year-old boy who's just set himself up a small tree den in the branches. The housing estate itself consists of terraced houses with rear gardens and driveways, and one house on a corner plot that overlooks the rope swings features a kind of communal style front garden where the children also congregate. There's a crescent-shaped road in front of the houses, which is pretty low traffic and so safe enough for children to roam. But across the grassy strip, however, there lies a busier A road that is seldom crossed by unaccompanied children. However, there's a big tree stump next to that busy road, which those children have also used for a variety of purposes, including as a stall for selling refreshments to unwitting public as they wander past. So these children from the local area, many of whom have played at the swing since they were toddlers, they're now allowed to come to the swing themselves without adults, and they bring along their school friends. Families and teenagers passing through also often stop for a quick swing. And because of that use, the grass beneath the swing is worn bare, a testament to its popularity. This particular patch of land is owned by a local housing association whose maintenance workers are often seen looking at the swings, but they've never taken them down. So that's just one everyday but life-affirming example of children's play. If we take a moment to consider what contributes to that scenario, it quickly becomes evident that children's capability to play, like Ben was saying, and their associated play patterns are relationally produced and codependent on a multitude of these interrelated personal, social, environmental, and structural factors and forces that, in this particular scenario, combine to create localized conditions that render this space more rather than less open to the possibility of playing. So it includes the proximity of the space to the homes, the arrangement of the housing, the presence of trees, the low level of traffic, the number of neighbourhood children, the tolerance of adults, and so on. And as Ben said, we can think of these as variables influencing children's opportunities to play, which operate at various scales, from children's personal characteristics and preferences to their social and environmental experiences of home, neighbourhoods and communities, through to organisational and structural influences of local and national governance, and even broader geopolitical issues. And in our literature review, Playing and Being Well, we included a list of these such variables identified through the research. And we're just going to give you a kind of overview of that variety. Ben?
So the appeal of predominantly indoor-based digital technologies, the presence of older siblings and numbers of children in the house, family routines and schedules, including parental work patterns, the free time available to children and other obligations on their time.
As well as cultural norms and expectations on parents and children, parental perceptions of neighbourhood safety, people's sense of community and levels of social trust, the demographics of particular neighbourhoods, levels of crime and violence, traumatic events, myths and rumours, media coverage of such crime and violence and tragic events involving children.
As well as the extent to which a culture of playing out exists and associated tolerance from adults, space available in and outside children's homes, settlement size and type, urbanisation and associated urban form, volume and speed of traffic and levels of on-street parking, for example, street connectivity and the availability of traffic-free routes.
And of course, the proximity, number, variety, connectedness and biodiversity of spaces for play, and the design and maintenance of public spaces, including how safe they feel, as well as school location and distances between home and school, and weather, time of year, number of daylight hours.
And of course, all of the above are subject to the intersections of poverty, marginalisation, racism, ableism, sexism, classism, privatisation of public space, the commercialisation of play provision, consumer culture, corporate interests and regulation of such like, government ideology, associated policy and levels of public investment, and of course public liability concerns and health and safety culture.
So that isn't an exhaustive list, but it serves to demonstrate the range of influencing variables that adults need to pay attention to when assessing and evaluating how children's opportunities to play are shaped by the hyperlocal and wider context of their lives. And in doing so, those making such assessments will be better placed to identify actions that can protect and enhance assets that support play, as well as reducing constraints on children's freedom to play. So all this means is that there's a lot more to think about when it comes to children's play, but fortunately, there are places where these variables work in support of children's continued desire to play out, and we can learn a lot from those kind of places. Ben, give them an example.
Okay, so this example of play sufficiency comes from a semi-rural village with a population of about 1,000 inhabitants. The village starts at the bottom of a valley, extending upwards on the steep valley side. It's a former coal mining community, and most people know each other there and have lived in the village most, if not all, of their lives. The village comprises of mostly terraced housing, built around streets and cul-de-sacs, snaking their way up the sides, as I've said, of the steep valley. That kind of slows moving cars down, but moving in parked cars are still common, as are multiple pathways, some official and some not. And then they've been kind of worn over generations as the quickest way to get from one place to the next. There's woodland, a small river, small fishing lake, all on the edges of the village. And the village itself is situated between three formal playgrounds, each of its three furthermost points, if you like. A group of 10 children, all aged around 10 or 11, who live in the various places across the village, reported to us that they played out most days. Most of them could identify by name 10 to 16 places that they played. They could even name them. When asked about playing, they rarely mentioned playing at home. They talked about destinations for playing, the incidental features along their routes as they wayfared across the community. They all watch YouTube and they all play on their phones. They all have homework to do and they occasionally do some organised activities. But those are all in addition to playing out with friends, not instead of. And I suppose that really brings into focus this idea of play sufficiency as an organising principle. It offers a radical and powerful way of rethinking our priorities for children, families and communities. And when we prioritise play alongside other adult agendas and position play as central to our thinking, we can ensure children and their way of engaging with the world has much greater influence over how we govern and the design of environments and services we create for people. Play is central to children's lives and to them being well. Children, their play and well-being is also unsurprisingly a priority for their parents and carers. It's a significant positive influence on social cohesion and the development of wider social community networks amongst both adults and children. And finally, most adults, even if they're not parents, remember playing fondly and value efforts to support it and can see the wider benefits of those efforts on community sociability and interaction. It's because of that interconnectedness that play sufficiency is a good organising principle for local authorities and local communities, because it requires adults to pay greater attention to the ways their decisions and actions support or constrain children's ability to find time and space to play, and can be a shared agenda around which efforts to improve things can be arranged, coordinated and implemented. In our experiences working with adults, we've found that when given the opportunity to use the concepts that we're sort of talking through today as ways of influencing their thinking, they've quickly come to realise the unintended consequences of existing policies and practices, and been able to identify ways in which those policies and practices can be re-augmented, if you like, to better support the conditions that support play. Equally, we found that those same adults working with the principle of play sufficiency have found it deeply motivating and transformative, which doesn't happen in all of our work. Mike.
So the concept of play sufficiency, as we've said, provides a kind of a different lens through which we can examine a wide range of issues and variables to consider how they impact on the rights of children and explore how they might be reimagined and rearranged to create these more favourable conditions for playing. This is, as Ben's just described, transformative for those who are open to working with the idea. But this is, as Wendy mentioned, more than just a concept. There are tried and tested ways of doing play sufficiency. We're particular fans of the cyclical nature of the Welsh duty, which was introduced in two parts. So we had the duty to assess the sufficiency of children's opportunities to play, and then the duty to secure play sufficiency based on the findings of those assessments. So you can see there's both a research and action element, which brings us to this idea that the ongoing process of play sufficiency is dependent on both the accountability and responsibility of adults, with these dual processes being mutually dependent. Our ability to change the way we respond in support of children's play depends on how we're accounting for it and our influences upon it. And accountability in this context is about our ability as adults to take account of children's everyday play lives, to understand the conditions children and their caregivers are experiencing in their immediate localities and how these shape opportunities for play. Accountability is then also about accounting for the ways in which we as adults impact both positively and negatively, directly and indirectly, on children's capability to find time and space for play. Throughout our experiences of doing play sufficiency, research with children has consistently been a catalyst for change. But we would also argue that if we're serious about securing play sufficiency for all children, we need a strategic and robust approach, both in terms of generating credible evidence on which to base our interventions, as well as evaluating the results. And this is where combining research methods is really important. So quantitative surveys, the ones you ask a lot of people to fill in multiple choice answers, they're really useful for generating a large response rate, establishing a baseline and key performance indicators, as well as identifying generalised trends in children's play patterns and differences in experiences across communities. But to really understand why things are the way they are and what we might do in response requires more qualitative research at a hyperlocal level, including face-to-face research with children and things like detailed spatial audits. And in doing so, we have to recognise that there isn't one universal version of childhood, but of course many diverse childhoods and therefore many different experiences in terms of opportunities for play, influenced by age, again, gender, location, disability, class, ethnicity, race, religion, and so on. And these variables intersect to create a kaleidoscope of experiences. But by paying attention to these diverse and different experiences, we can build a picture of who is and who isn't experiencing play sufficiency, and importantly, the reasons for this.
A really clear example of that, that aspect of the process is the work we did with the local authority on the experiences of play insufficiency. And as part of their more general play sufficiency assessment, they'd identified children experiencing low levels of satisfaction with their opportunities for play and predicted that might be because of their particular protected characteristics. And they set upon specifically taking account of that. They researched with children that were also carers, children with English as a second language or as an additional language, Gypsy Romani traveller children, and rurally isolated children. But this example is of the experiences of children educated outside of mainstream school in a pupil referral unit. Children educated in that pupil referral unit faced unique challenges in their play experiences. Due to the space and resource limitations, their play was often consisted of structured, sedentary activities, and it offered little escape from the constraints of the classroom. Breaks and play times were often earned through a point system, which further limited their opportunities for play. The unit worked with children from both junior and secondary school simultaneously, and the small space available for play poorly facilitated their varied play experiences. Contest among younger and older children was common over scarce resources, and opportunities for play was further constrained by rules put into place to reduce the disturbance to people who lived in adjacent residential properties. Beyond school, the same children reported minimal or no opportunities to play outside the home. For some, bullying, neighbourhood safety concerns, parental fears over accusations of antisocial behaviour limited them from playing out independently at all. As a result, their play was often confined to screen-based activities at home, and that resilience on virtual entertainment often being reinforced by parents and support services as a way to ensure safety or manage behaviour, further constrain them from engaging in their play. Children attending the unit outside of their neighbourhood experience isolation from their neighbourhood playmates and peers, limiting their connectedness to their local community and neighbourhood friendship networks. And the resultant effect being that their friendship networks were made up of friends from a diverse geographic area that also attended the PRU and who they also only got to meet during school term time. As one practitioner told us, school's often the only place where meaningful play can happen for these children. And that kind of highlighted the need for a more robust and inclusive play provision. For these children, a quality school playtime intervention could significantly increase their opportunities to play, as could the provision of some form of neighbourhood playwork project where trained staff might give parents the confidence to allow their children to play out and to attend, and where those children could then be supported to reintegrate, if you like, with their local neighbourhood peers once more. Mike.
So, as Ben has alluded to at the end of that story, the other aspect of play sufficiency, our responsibility, is about taking evidence from research, how we've accounted for play, and comparing it with various areas of policy and practice to explore the extent to which the way we do things supports or constrains children's play. This is about critiquing our habits of thought, language and action that make environments more or less open to the possibilities for children to play. And responses are likely to include, planning for play at an organisational and neighbourhood level, combining infrastructure improvements with activation. But doing so also requires a decentering of fixed professional roles, working together across professional domains, recognising our collective wisdom and responsibilities towards children in their play. A tool that we found really useful in thinking about the range of responses required is adapted from Ashar Min's Registers of a Good City. So here, repair and maintenance is about protecting and maintaining the times, spaces, policies and practices that currently enable play, as well as repairing how things work to better support play. Relatedness is about working with difference, and that includes recognising that children experience their environments differently to adults, as well as the many different professions that impact on play, bringing people together to develop a more collaborative and comprehensive response. But rights is about paying attention to and upholding children's collective right to play throughout adult decision making, and recognising that this right is closely linked to other rights associated with children's participation in public life, their freedom of expression and opportunities to gather together. And then re-enchantment is about the many, often small-scale actions that can be taken to re-enchant people's connection to children's play and the public realm for playing, recognising that children's play itself can reactivate and enliven such spaces. So across the last 12 years or so, we've seen a wide range of strategic responses in support of play sufficiency. And by way of conclusion to the presentation, we're simply going to list some of those. Go on, Ben.
So, for example, high-level commitment to the principle of play sufficiency and the endorsement of strategic priorities at local authority cabinet level.
The development of organisational play policies and position statements.
Formation of strategic partnerships overseeing play sufficiency action plans.
Multi-agency conferences exploring play in particular contexts, for example, schools.
Major improvements in partnership working across professional domains.
Health and safety policies that promote a balanced risk-benefit approach to children's play.
Impact assessment processes that pay attention to children's right to play.
Supplementary planning guidance that promotes a broader approach to providing for play.
Appointing a play sufficiency lead officer.
Neighbourhood-wide plans for play.
Things like street play projects, including regular street closures.
And school street projects, closing streets outside of schools.
Things like large-scale play events and pop-up installations to promote play.
Interventions in schools to improve children's freedom at playtimes.
Shifting the delivery of play schemes from only in the summer holidays to being right across the school term time.
Increases in community council funding for play.
Taking a community development approach to play work.
Inclusion projects enabling specific children to access play provision.
Either the gifting of leftover land from private landowner or lease agreements amongst landowners and community councils.
And of course, allowing rope swings to stay up.
And the list continues to grow as more and more people adopt the principle of play sufficiency. Thanks, Wendy. We're done.
Back to you.
Back to you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. Really brings it down to that. The slide with the circles on it, which to answer Amy's question has more than a small nod to Bronfman Brenner, yes. But one of the things that I wanted to say about that is not just how much is in there. I mean, that is it basically. that it's what some geographers call a flat ontology. So there's not a hierarchy of influences on the conditions for children to play, or children's capabilities, relational capabilities to play, and therefore be and do well. Everything affects everything else in such a entangled way. So that slide is doing an awful lot of work. Thank you very much for that. And then you brought it out into, and what does this actually mean in practice? Thank you so much for that. The biggest theme for me that's come out of both the panel conversation and Ben and Mike's presentation is, I can't remember the exact wording, but there is something in General Comment 17 that says play takes place. It's a spatial thing, it takes place. Play takes place anywhere and any time when the conditions allow. That's probably not an exact quote, but there is something like that in there. And this applies across all the contexts of children's lives, whatever that is. So that just kind of sums that up. I know there are some questions in the chat, so I will hand over to Marianne, or share the chairing with Marianne now to ask questions.
Sure. So there's one last comment in the chat, which I think I can answer and then follow up with a link in the chat. And it's from a participant who, I think it was when Ben and Mike were giving those lovely examples at the end of their discussion about how actions can relate to the 4 registers. And there's about, is there a list? Do you have it written? There is some research that Wendy, Ben and Mike have done into the Welsh place sufficiency duties, which bring to light some of those very local examples. So I'll share a link. I'll share a link in the chat afterwards. There's a few questions which Mike have responded to, but others might want to add to. The one, and some of this will be answered in the next webinar, which will be in February, about similar work in England, and with a comment that it feels like this is crucial to work in all countries. So just I know there will be an opportunity for representatives from the other UK nations to reflect on place sufficiency in the webinar that's following in February, but I didn't know if any of you wanted to respond to that.
Yes, we should have one in every home country of the UK. Speaking as a person who lives in England.
Yeah. Okay. So there are some specific, I think we'll start with the kind of in chronological order, if that's okay with the questions. One, again, partially answered by Mike in the chat, but it was about kind of the beautifulness of an ambiguity of the English language, and are sufficiency and adequacy interchangeable terms?
I think Mike did answer that a little. Yes, I'll go back to you, Mike, on that one.
They are. They mean exactly the same thing, and I'm not entirely sure why we ended up with sufficiency. It starts with an S, not an A. I don't know. But they work. I think the question referred to one measurable and one not measurable, and the conversation, the solicitors that we were talking to were saying they're not measurable, and we were saying no, they're not. That you may say that in terms of objectively, but actually when we're talking about children's play, number one, it's subjective, and it's how children feel about it. So for us, that was actually really useful to go through that process.
I remember too, in those early days, discussions about the value of vagueness, that everything else is pinned down and held in numbers, and the concept of sufficient, which I think sounds slightly more than adequate, is necessarily vague, and that's quite good. Okay, thank you. Did you want to add to that, Mike? The other Mike?
Just to say about the use of kind of vague language. I mean, this is a point that's previously been made by Professor David Ball when talking about the Health and Safety at Work Act and the principle to do what's reasonable. And it's actually the ambiguity that requires a more thoughtful response. So you have to think about what is reasonable, what is sufficient, and that engages more people in the conversation, which is the whole point of the exercise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So sufficiency is a process, an ongoing process.
And
Marianne.
sorry, and what
sorry.
I was going to say, sorry, if I can just add to that, is that what is sufficient for one child may not be sufficient for another. A lot of it is based on previous history and experience. And at the time, we were being asked, well, what would be a sufficient playground? And I said, well, my ideal playground would have a space for all children to light a fire whenever they want. And everybody held their hands up. And I said, well, exactly, I rest my case. You go to some of the other countries, some of the Nordic countries, and that is actually what you expect to find because that's what's there. Whereas actually, so whatever was sufficient at that moment in time might not necessarily be sufficient later on. It had to be kept ambiguous.
Okay, thanks, Marianne.
Okay, so kind of an early question was how much of a focus of General Comment 17 is on disabled children, children with special educational needs, children with additional learning needs, as referred to here in Wales. They tend to be, I think the participant was mentioning that they tend to be included in theory, but perhaps later forgotten at delivery level or at experiential level. So I think Theresa will want to come in.
Yeah, so go to Theresa for that. Yeah.
Well, it was just I saw that question popping up. I think it was Sarah, and so it's given me a little bit of time to think about it in relation to the general comment. I don't know if it's really answering the question directly, but just to reflect a little bit about how children, the play rights of disabled children are included within the general comment in a very sort of intentional way. And I think the questioner, I think it was Sarah, had asked, was right to draw attention to that. And within the general comment, disabled children, children with additional support needs, are considered one of the groups of children who we need to pay particular attention to their rights. And there's a direct comment about how we need to do that, how important it is. And it's exactly what the questioner said, was that because often there will be a mention of inclusion at the top lines and, in our policies and so forth. But when it comes to actually putting things into practice, then it's not necessarily the case. I think that paragraph about children, disabled children, and paying particular attention to the rights draws a distinction about how often disabled children are given something lesser as play, that it's very much colonized. Often it's considered play by adults, but actually it's something like rehabilitation, or there's some kind of other agenda, and actually doesn't meet the definition that's right up at the top of the general comment about what do we mean by play. There was also another question there about differences between play and recreation, and the general comment actually does talk quite extensively about how we can make those distinctions between those areas of Article 31, which again is another important area. I did want to give some examples. So I think that the rights of disabled children, when we first did the consultations about infringements, and we did consultations all around the world, so disabled children's infringements of disabled children's right to play came up consistently right across the world. Every place where we talked about it, it was drawn attention to. When we were doing the drafting of the general comment for the first time, I understand, this general comment was one where there was consultation with children, and so there was a bit of a groundbreaking moment that IPA was able to work with, again because of having a network of people who are in contact with children on a regular basis. And disabled children were consulted, and so again that was another thing that happened in the process. So that is it's just an important part of like how the general comment was written and the approach that was taken to including the voices of children and linking really closely the idea of children's participation as a way of like children's a process of fulfilling their rights, of their being able to claim their rights, so children's participation being very much part of that. There is an example here in Scotland. So I'm in the Scottish contingent today. So I was doing part of a place efficiency assessment in the local authority area where I live. There's just been 2 in Scotland so far. And we were asked to look at playgrounds and whether they were accessible and inclusive for children with disabilities. And we looked across the whole of the county and found not one accessible and inclusive play space across the whole of our county. So which really drew attention to the sort of stark difference between like what we're aspiring to, and then those children who were supposed to pay the most attention to their rights, what the reality is for them. So it just kind of loops back to that whole thing about accountability, using the general comment that talks about universal design and non-discrimination, or that Article 31 is about the core concerns of the convention, what it is to be a child, the pleasure of being a child. It loops back to all of those kind of things and gives us, I think, for those of us in positions where we're advocating for children's rights and for children's play, or who are in the position where you're a decision maker, the general comment is about having a tool in your hand, then, the direction. It's telling you not just it would be nice to do these things, but actually you have an obligation to do these things. Not for just some of the children or the children that it's easiest, to support and meet their needs and their rights, but for all of our children. So I am aware that doesn't actually answer the question, but just maybe a bit of reflection on the rights of disabled children within the general comment.
Thank you, Theresa. It's definitely there in the general comment, and it's specified in the Welsh Place Sufficiency Duty literature as well. Quite what that means on the ground is, as you say, something very different. Thank you very much for that. Marianne.
So I think that there are some reflective philosophical thoughts that I think perhaps may be better encapsulated as we come to the end of the series of webinars, and I think they will take us down a cul-de-sac. But I think I will just let Theresa mentioned recreation. There is a question around distinguishing between play and for children of all ages, so a nod towards older children, and then one more specific question around general comment, which I think would be useful in terms of the scope of this particular webinar. So just I think clarity from the panel about, does play sufficiency apply to teenagers and younger children?
It's a very good question. A lot of the focus in Wales certainly has been on middle childhood. So did you indicate Mike Greenaway, did you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, if I could. Can I so this has been a conundrum for a long time, and whatever we say, people go, well, play isn't recreation, play is recreation. In England, in the UK, before devolution, the UK Parliament said the recreation was a word that encompasses play. When we got to the sufficiency legislation in Wales, for some reason, and to this day I have no idea why, the Welsh government decided that play encompassed recreation, which really caused it caused a real problem at the beginning when it was introduced. I think we've ironed it out now. So when Theresa and I were briefing Jerison, one of the things we wanted the general comment to address was, for the purposes of policy making, what do we mean when we talk about play? What do we mean when we talk about recreation? And what do we mean when we talk about leisure? And whilst those, it's one definition of recreation, it's one definition of play. But as far as we're concerned, it really helped. And that is, and the general comment helps, that the definition of play is if it's child directed, it's not directed by adults. It's what children are doing for themselves. Whereas recreation is when it's directed by adults. Now, I know people will say, well, that's not the way it is, but we need some form of demarcation as far as we're concerned when we're talking about policy. But in terms of play, hell, I watch my children and they're in their 40s and I watch them playing. So we don't stop playing. It's important for all of us.
Thanks. I know also some of the policy research in Wales acknowledges that older children teenagers don't necessarily call what they do playing. and so sometimes you throw hanging out into the mix of words used as well.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add anything on that one before we move on to the next question? The other Mike.
Just to say, I mean, a good place if you're going to do research with children is asking them what they think playing means, so you can make sure you're on the same page about it. And having done this research with, I don't know, thousands of children, how they talk about play aligns with the UN committee's definition of play. It's the stuff that you get to do when somebody's not telling you what to do, and it can happen anywhere as long as it's about having freedom. Yeah. And they might call it hanging out, but it fits the same characteristics. It is this stuff that they're in control of, and it doesn't have obligations, and they have a sense of freedom that goes alongside it. But it's a good place to begin when you're going to have conversations with them.
Okay, thank you very much. Did you want to squeeze another one in, Marianne, or shall we?
I think looking at the time, you're probably
yes. Okay, so. It's time to bring it to a close, definitely. So hopefully this has helped, and you now know a bit more about the history and what place sufficiency is and what it actually looks like when you do it. So I'd like to extend a massive thank you to our speakers and panelists today, Mike Greenaway, Theresa Casey, Keith Towler, Mike Barclay and Ben Tawil, and thanks to Playwells for supporting us with the admin and tech, and also to Genero. I'm so pleased I didn't have to do that myself. Thanks also to those of you who asked such good questions and shared information. If you're interested in how different countries approach play policy, take a look at the IPA's latest Playwrights magazine. That talks about play policies from UK, Ireland, India, Aotearoa, New Zealand. You will be sent an evaluation form from today. Please do fill it in. This was the first one, and we have learned a lot from this. And please help us to make the next ones better. So fill in your evaluation form. The next one is on Tuesday, the 25th of February, at the same time, 12:30 to 2 p.m. GMT. Sorry for those that's the middle of the night for. And we will be, so some of the questions that you asked today hopefully will be addressed in the next one. We will be looking at national perspectives on play sufficiency, sharing examples of possible responses to play insufficiency and play sufficiency at national level, and exploring what makes those responses possible. So the fantastic speakers we have lined up for you are Marianne Manello, who's been doing a lot of the work on play sufficiency in Play Wales, Ruth Conway from the Welsh Government, Marguerite Hunter-Blair, OBE, freshly, congratulations, from Play Scotland, Eugene Minogue from Play England, Alan Heron from Playboard Northern Ireland, and we will also be bringing you an example of play sufficiency or working towards play sufficiency at a national level in a very specific context, and that context is that of healthcare, so children in healthcare settings, and that will be Adrian Vos from Starlight talking about that. So if you want to attend, please register for each webinar that you want to attend. Dead on 2 o'clock. Thank you so much, everybody, and hopefully see you next time.